Welcome to Africa's Vision Network. My name is Omar Ashaka, your guest host. Our program today is called Making a Joyful Noise, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Our special guest is the Reverend Congressman Walter E. Fauntroy. Welcome again, Reverend Fauntroy.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I know time is going to fly, but we want to try to have another interesting show like we did the first time.
Mm-hmm.
But first, I know you lost a very dear friend, the Reverend Louis Anthony. I'd like to give you the opportunity to say a few words about Reverend Anthony.
Yes. Louis M. Anthony was a clone of Martin Luther King Jr., in many ways, Malcolm X was. He was a genius, like Martin. He finished high school here in Washington at Anacostia High School at 15 years of age. Went on to get a bachelor's degree at Columbia University at the head of his class. Then decided he was going to Harvard to get a law degree. And when he finished that, he decided he was going to be a minister of the gospel and aced his exams at Harvard Divinity School.
Wow.
Martin did the same thing. He graduated from high school at 15 and went on to Boston University, to Crozier University, Crozier Theological Seminary, where he received the Master's of Divinity degree, and then from Crozier he went on to Boston University to receive a PhD in systematic theology. Brilliant man.
Now, it's interesting, Reverend Fauntroy, because I had a chance to meet Reverend Anthony on a couple of occasions, and I always thought he reminded me of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as well. Real quick, though, I know that Reverend Anthony's mother played a critical role in making him the man that he became. Can you, I don't know if her name, I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about her role real quick as his mother?
Louis had a remarkable mother whose, and his father left her after his birth to rear him by herself. And she did with the help of the Lord. She was a minister's daughter who knew the Lord and understood what the Apostle Paul, when he told Timothy, study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And she poured that into this little genius who became my chief assistant at 12 years of age. When I graduated from Virginia Union University and went on to finish Yale Divinity School, I came back to be pastor of New Bethel Baptist Church, the church of my childhood, with a desire to change the neighborhood in which I'd grown up. He was a student at Shaw Junior High School.
Yeah, and I know, excuse me, in the first interview you talked about that. One last point on his mother, because I always like to give credit to mothers
Sure.
who are raising children and the father is absent. She did something, I believe, somewhat unusual. She gave the eulogy for Reverend Anthony, if I'm not mistaken. Can you briefly talk about that, and then we're going to talk about some more questions.
She simply said that she cared for him for the last 2 months of his life, at a time when he had terminal cancer. And she nurtured him. Nobody could find her. I couldn't find her. But she was determined. She brought him in here, and she was going to see him on home. And when he went home, in her arms, between her and his little brother, they celebrated his homegoing.
What a remarkable story, Reverend Fauntroy. Let me get into the questions real quick. Excuse me. Men like Dr. Martin Luther King, I didn't get a chance to ask you this the last time, But quickly, can you give me 3 adjectives that would be the ingredients that make a man like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?
I think the prophet who said it was a man, David was a man after God's own heart, he was talking about Martin Luther King Jr. and about many people who give themselves totally and completely to the service of others. Jesus taught us to live for the sake of others through the prophet Isaiah, who said, "You are anointed of God to declare good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to set at liberty them that are bound." And that was Martin Luther King Jr.
As well as Reverend Congressman Walter E. Fauntroy.
Just trying to be like Jesus.
Okay. Reverend Fauntroy, excuse me, this is a question I was curious about. I have it here. I'm not sure if it will make any sense, but how would you respond in your mind and verbally when I ask the question, do men of God cry?
And the answer is yes. Jesus, who was the Spirit of God made flesh, wept when he thought of his servant Lazarus. He wept. In fact, that's the first verse that I memorized. I had one, Jesus wept.
Okay.
And any man who has empathy is the ability to assume another's burden as if it were your very own. Jesus assumed our burden as if it were his very own. And in so doing, he taught us to pray, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And he said, and he told us that if you give your life for the sake of others, you will live on eternally with me, because I am a spirit, and they that worship me must worship me in the spirit of Jesus. Martin had the spirit of Jesus. Little Louis, at 12 years of age, had the spirit of Jesus, and he lives on forever.
Okay. Well, and that's, excuse me, a very interesting response, because, excuse me, in our society, men seem to think that they can't cry, and even some saved men. But let me move on, because time is moving quickly. Do you consider yourself a Pan-Africanist?
Without question, I owe my affection for Africa to a fellow by the name of Lou Rawls, who was a magnificent baritone who sang a song in my early youth that Martin and I drank up like it was water. He said, my ancestors were kings of old. They ruled the world and all of its gold. I majored in history, and I studied history the way I studied the Word, the way that Paul told Timothy, study to show yourself approved unto man, no, approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And so when he spoke that truth as a growing historian, I said, I'm going to study that.
Well, Reverend Fauntroy, how critical in today's society, specifically in the African American community, is that history?
That it is the history of the first people. That's what he was saying. We were the first people. We now know. DNA tells us, all of the scientists, nobody disputes the fact that the first human beings on the planet were black people in sub-Saharan Africa. And God placed between the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in sub-Saharan Africa all the wealth that the world needs to feed all of its hungry, to clothe all of its naked, to provide all the medicine that it needs, to provide the income, and above all, the protection, right there. And so our ancestors were masters of all the sciences, and were so compassionate that when they saw some of those whom God had created like them had a lack of melanin in their skins, and they were bleached by the sun in the sub-Saharan Africa. And so our ancestors said, we must treat our brothers and sisters better than that. We know that we can take them north, across this sea out here, to the land over there. The sun won't shine directly on them, and the rays will be as oblique, and they will be able to live. And so they took them, these albinos, took them across the Mediterranean Sea to what is now France and Germany and all of that, and said, look, you can live here, and we will bring you food, if necessary, because the land of our birth has the richest soil in the world.
Well, Reverend Fauntroy, that's a good lead into my next question. Do you think that most African countries will eventually become independent of their former colonial rulers?
That is written down on paper in the Word of God. John F. Kennedy understood that. And that's why in his inaugural address, he said, here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. God has no hands but our hands. And if we do his work, all human beings of every race and every creed and color will be free and independent, will have adequate income, education, health care, housing, and justice, protection from those who would steal from them and kill them and deny them their God-given right to three things: life, liberty, and the right to pursue happiness. That's what the founding fathers of our great nation understood, specifically Thomas Jefferson, who was asked to write the Declaration of Independence, who said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men of every race, creed, and color are created by God, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, rights that man can't give and man can't take, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's what our mandate is.
Well, and that response probably ties into, because I was going to ask you about, what do you think about the future of South Africa in terms of the native people, if you will, the indigenous people of South Africa? I mean, I was in the Peace Corps in West Africa and Niger, and I saw some things for myself that did not suggest that the indigenous people were in control, that the outsiders were in control. But
you understand that when you understand the word in Deuteronomy, when the writer, the prophet, the man who comes from God to the people with a message, said that there was a time when the sons of God, all the children of God, assembled, and Satan came also among them. Who is Satan? Satan was one of those created by God in his image, but who decided, we are not going to follow your 10 commandments. I am going to rule the world you're creating because I know the weakness of the human beings. You've created these black people down here and people of every race, creed, and color. I know their weakness. And the Apostle Paul cautioned Timothy by saying, Timothy, know this, the love of money is a root of all evil. And every human being on this planet knows that whenever they have been deeply hurt, it's because somebody didn't want them to have money for income, education, health care, housing, and protection.
well, that also leads into another question that I was going to ask you. What do you think about Zimbabwe's future? And it's kind of interesting because the next part of this question, what do you think of President Robert Mugabe? Now, that's interesting to me because he's been in power, from what I understand, since 1980. I was in the Peace Corps from 79 to 81. I often wonder why one person feel they have to be in power so long.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an element of selfishness? Because rather than passing on the baton.
Yeah. I know Mugabe very well, and I know that God uses human beings for his purposes. Mugabe was a fierce Africanist who resented the fact that the richest soil in the world had flowed down from Lake Victoria up the Nile to Zimbabwe and most of sub-Saharan Africa, and that soil can produce everything the whole world needs. He understood why God told, through Jesus Christ, told us to multiply, because you can populate not just the earth, but the entire universe over time. And so he believed that. And so when a fellow by the name of Cecil Rhodes, who was a pedophile, who was commissioned to take Zimbabwe and call it Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, after himself, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And to make pedophiles and to make homosexuals of little children to sell on the market to Europe and to others who wanted prostitutes, who wanted pedophiles, who wanted gigolos, that's the males who satisfy women, and lesbians, the dykes, excuse the expression.
Right.
But
well, so Mugabe, because of this knowledge that he had, you feel like he was meeting the purpose of God?
No, he was clear that God's purpose was that his children of every race, creed, and color were not to be. He said, you go multiply, but you don't mess over one another. Children, better that a millstone be hung around your neck and you be dropped in the depths of the sea than that you touch the least one of the least of these, my little ones. That he believed that, and he believed that God being his helper, he was not going to be like Elijah, who said, Lord, I'm the only one left who's doing your work. And God had to take Elijah up on a mountain and said, listen, stand here. An earthquake came, a fire came, and God was not in the fire, but in a still small voice. Said, you do my will, and your barns will be filled with plenty, and your wine presses will overflow with new wine. Don't put new wine in old bottles.
Well, you mentioned something too, and this is kind of like an add-on to that question. You mentioned prostitution. And I'll say this real quick because I know time is moving on. I know when I was in the Peace Corps, I did see a lot of prostitutes.
Oh, you always.
And I often wondered, I know HIV was a big thing over in Africa, and probably still is in certain areas. And so when you have that prostitution going on, and it wasn't a lot of the local people who were supporting the prostitution, it was a lot of those other individuals coming to the country. But let me move on real quick. In your opinion, when you think about where Libya is today, was it wise for Muammar Gaddafi to be killed?
It was not God's will, because Muammar Gaddafi was working with me and working with those of us like Mugabe who said God does not intend for one race to be exploiting another for money, whether for prostitution or giving them AIDS, but they gave them to them deliberately, and causing all kinds of sexual diseases. That's not God's purpose. I'm going to change this myself. And when he who was sent as a Jewish white man to take from the Senussis, the black family that were the patriarchs of Libya, when he did it. But after a while, he said, look, I'm tired of this. I serve God.
This is Muammar Gaddafi saying?
Muammar Gaddafi. He was a Muslim. And he says, but he says we're all brothers and sisters. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad instructs all Muslims. You ought to follow three people. You ought to follow Moses, the lawgiver, Abraham, the father of the faith, and most important, Jesus, the immaculately conceived child of God, who is a spirit. He's not flesh, he's a spirit. And they that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. I'll give you my spirit. And this man had God's spirit, and he ended I worked on him for 20 years, quite frankly, to get him to take this, the richest, the best oil in the whole world, which is produced almost exclusively in Libya. It's called light oil. Without that light oil, you cannot fly a plane, a jet plane, anywhere in the world. You've got to have sweet oil from Libya. And you cannot grow food any better than is grown in the valley of the shadow of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the Nile River brings down the richest soil from the world, from Kilimanjaro down to Lake Victoria, and then overflows into Nigeria, into Kenya, and into Zimbabwe. Here?
So, in your opinion, it was a mistake to have him killed? Because like you said, too.
It was evil to have him killed, just as it was evil to have Abraham Lincoln killed, because he said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and I'm going to free the slaves. And he freed them in 1863. And by 65, they killed him. Huh? And then when Mugabe was shown to be resolute, they castrated him. Huh? Because they thought any black who would challenge them had to have too much testosterone. So
Now,
they had a little gadget that would snatch the testicles from black men who were too muscular, they said.
Now, but when you say they, are you able to say who they happen to be?
I precisely am, because I know. I oversaw in my senior years, after 10 years of serving on the Banking, Finance, and Urban Affairs Committee, I came to oversee the Federal Reserve System, which prints all the money in the world, down on 14th Street here in Washington, gives every dollar, every bill, a serial number, so that if they want to cancel it out, as they did on me when I went to organize.
Right, I'm sorry. I just got a cue. We got about 5 minutes. So,
okay.
So you said they.
The bankers
Okay.
whom the bishops of the Church of God in Christ, gave all the money in Italy to 4 banking families.
Okay. All right. Let me move on, because I want to get this last question in. China, which I've always thought is a very interesting country.
Yes.
How do you see China's role in Africa? And again, we only have a few moments because we want to have you to sing.
China has all of the weakness of all of the men in the world, all the people in the world, and that is they want to control things. And they have controlled the world by making sure that the people who are most populous in the world, in China, work for nothing, huh? And they produce all these things cheaper than it can be produced anywhere in the world. And by the grace of God for us, they have now seized control. They've become the biggest. They've become what the United States became when designed by the Nazis who took over the United States. And I'll explain at some point what that means. 800 years ago, and killed all the legitimate Jews who were his children. And gave them a bad name.
Because I got the cues keep coming. We only have 3 minutes. But one thing I want to ask you, though, because you talked about how God said we need to multiply.
Yeah.
So China is clearly obeying God in that respect.
No.
They're not?
They decided long ago that they were going to limit the number of people.
That's changing, though, from what I understand.
No, it's changing because of what we now know about how the whole universe is available to us if we keep the 10 Commandments and depend upon God's grace and mercy to forgive us for our sinful, wicked ways. And he does. Okay. He's able to carry us through.
Reverend Fauntroy, we're going to get ready to wrap this up because we're going to have you to perform. But can you quickly share with our audience, what's your formula for a better African-American community, which ultimately will be a better America as well? But with the killings of our young people, unemployment, homosexuality, the craziness with prison incarceration of our young folks, can you, and I know it's, you know, it's hard for you to do it quickly because there's a lot to it, but what do you want to tell our audience who are watching right now?
Yeah.
Because we need a
Yeah.
change.
I have formed something called the African American Global Initiative Fostering True Sustainability. It's called AA Gifts. We want to give a gift to the world, and it's to stop us from killing one another in every race, creed, and color by turning us against one another rather than to one another.
Okay. Reverend Fauntroy, real quick, a yes or no, because we got to wrap it up. Are African American people on the verge of extinction?
No, because God will not allow that.
Okay.
And we are not going to allow it because we are going to say that we're all of value. Just like we say Black Lives Matter, all life matters. So don't make a pedophile of any child. Don't make a prostitute of any child, because if you do, you're going to reap what God said in His Word. Better that a millstone will hang about your neck and you're dropped into the middle of the sea than you touch one of the least of these, my little ones. That's God's Word. I believe it. That settles it.
Well, Reverend Fauntroy, thank you so much. We're going to have to do a part 3 and a part 4 and just on and on. But thank you very much, Reverend Fauntroy. And we want our audience to stay with us because we want them to hear your golden voice along with Mr. Memphis Gold and his band. But as I said before, God bless your whole soul.
Thank you so
Reverend
much
Fauntroy.
for being so faithful
Thank you very much.
and trusting the Lord with all your heart.
Thank you. And I'm so blessed to be able to sit here with you, Reverend Fauntroy, because you're a treasure to the African American community and the world. So
Thank you so much. Oh, that's sweet. So sweet.
You keep the door shut. You keep that door shut.
I know, Lord, will make a way. Oh, yes, He will. I know the Lord will make a way. Oh, yes, He will. And He'll make a way for me and for you. Oh, I know the Lord will see you through. I know the Lord will make a way. Here we go. Yes, He will. Yeah, try to hold that. Let him give you a little roll. Hold that left. If I can help. That's a good. I'm just using that. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can stand my duty with a word or song. If I can breathe
back beauty to a world distraught, then my living will not be in vain. Then my living will not be in vain. Then my living will not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. Then my living shall not be in vain. If I can help somebody as I pass along, then my living shall not be in vain. Oh, that's sweet. So sweet.